Hello YouTubers, and welcome to the slightly unexpected JKLenses video on medium format photography. This video is largely inspired by this quotation from the great photographic pioneer Jacques Lartigue. These words have always struck a chord with me right from my very first days of getting my hands on a camera. However, so much of what's talked about photography these days, including on this channel, is focused heavily on the technical specifications of the equipment, rather than on the joy of taking photographs that you're really pleased with. In this video I wanted to try and balance things out by talking about two cameras whose simply outstanding images always leave me wanting to go outside and photograph simply everything. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, they're both medium format cameras, one of which I've been using for decades and the other for only a few weeks. They also come from completely opposite ends of the price spectrum, with one costing about the same as a basic entry-level DSLR and the other having you wondering about 0% finance. If you're not familiar with medium format photography, then it simply refers to cameras which have a film or sensor size which is substantially bigger than the popular 35mm film or FX sensor size. 35mm film or the digital FX sensor are both 3.6 cm by 2.4 cm in size. Medium format sizes are descended from the use of 120 roll film, which comes in a strip which is about 6 cm wide. Most of the big hitters of medium format film photography built cameras which produced images which were a mighty 6 cm tall by 7 cm wide. This produced an image area which was nearly 5 times that of 35mm film or an FX sensor and allowed you to shoot 10 exposures on a 120 roll of film. A few manufacturers went for the slightly weird 6x6 format, which as its name suggests produced images which were 6 cm square. Obviously with a slightly smaller image size, this meant that you could squeeze 12 exposures out of your 120 roll of film. A later development was the so-called 645 format, which produced images which were 6 cm wide by 4.5 cm tall. Sometimes jokingly referred to as half-frame medium format, this system allowed you to get 15 exposures out of a 120 roll of film, while still giving you an image area substantially bigger than 35mm. The first medium format camera which I'd like to talk about is one which has been tremendous fun to use over the years and continues to deliver outstanding images, even when compared to the output from the latest 21st century FX DSLRs. The camera in question is the Mamiya M645 Super. As its name suggests, this camera delivers an image which is 6 cm by 4.5 cm, in other words over 3 times the size of a 35mm negative. This was one of the main reasons why this camera effortlessly produces images much better than those produced with the 35mm format. Firstly, the level of enlargement required to produce a given print size was obviously 3 times less. One of the downsides of the 35mm film size is that it needs to be enlarged many times to produce something like an A4 size print. With 645 size negatives, that level of enlargement is obviously 3 times less. This meant that the impact of almost anything that could detract from the image, such as grain or dust, etc., was again reduced by a factor of 3 or so. In addition, the 645 size negative allows a lot more flexibility for cropping the image, allowing you to tailor the aspect of the image to each individual subject. With an image size that starts off at around 3.5 by 2.5 cm, you really can't be doing a great deal of serious cropping before you end up with a negative that's not much bigger than a postage stamp. The increased size of the image being collected also improved its quality in many other respects, such as the depth and naturalness of the colours recorded. If you're thinking, however, but this is the 21st century and we have digital cameras now, then I'd like to come back to an important issue which I think has been kind of swept under the carpet over the past 20 years or so. The level of resolution available from a properly scanned 645 film negative is still substantially higher than that available from the latest FX censored DSLRs. An important question which all the major camera companies seem keen not to answer properly when the first DSLRs were introduced is just how many megapixels of resolution are film negatives capable of delivering. It's still difficult to get an objective and definitive answer on this, although from my experience I'd suggest figures well over 80 for 35mm negatives and probably into 3 figures for 645 or larger. Unsurprisingly, the manufacturers of the latest DSLR camera bodies tend not to advertise these figures very much, if at all. This is another reason why this camera has remained such a joy to use throughout the rapid rise of the digital sensor over the past couple of decades. Even today it can deliver levels of resolution and detail substantially better than that offered by even the most expensive FX sensor-sized DSLR. There's also the so-called medium format look of objects when they're photographed with an image size greater than 35mm or FX. This is to do with medium format's different relationship between focal length and angle of view when compared with other image sizes. For example, apart from a little bit of trimming at the sides, this picture basically covers a 50-degree angle of view, and is therefore what would be called a standard lens shot. On a camera making images on the 6x4.5 format, this requires a lens with a focal length of about 80mm. Now, if you imagine the same shot being taken with a camera using 35mm film or an FX sensor, then to get the same standard lens angle of view would require a lens with a focal length of only 50mm. Obviously the two images would contain the same objects, but the 645 image would have been taken with a lens with a longer focal length, and therefore with a shallower depth of field. This effect obviously happens at all focal lengths, and means that in like-for-like photographs, medium format cameras always deliver a shallower depth of field than is possible on the FX format. This is one of the reasons why many portrait photographers down the years have preferred medium format cameras over those using 35mm film or an FX sensor. This leads us neatly onto another feature of the M645 Super, which makes it a great camera for portrait work. In its basic form, the camera came fitted with what's known as a waist-level viewfinder, rather than the more conventional eye-level prism-based viewfinder, which is pretty much universal on FX DSLRs. As you can see, this is basically a rectangular metal shade, which allows you to look straight down through the ground glass screen onto the camera's mirror. It came equipped with a handy pop-up magnifying lens, which in combination with the format's thin depth of field allowed for super accurate focusing. The huge advantage of this viewfinder when photographing people is that it allowed you to take photographs without having a camera in front of your face. As the name suggests, you could easily take photographs while holding the camera at waist level. Pictures could easily be taken while sat at a table with somebody just as though you were having a normal conversation, allowing you to get very natural results. Even putting the camera on the ground was no problem at all, as all you needed to be able to do was to look in the top for composition and focusing. As you can see, the slender depth of field and much more natural shooting position means this camera can produce portrait shots which would be much more tricky to achieve using a conventional FX DSLR. The only slight wrinkle when using the waist level finder was the fact that because you're looking straight down into the camera's mirror, everything is left-right swapped over. As you can see from this mountain bike which is pointing to the right, it appears in the camera's viewfinder as though it's pointing to the left. Although slightly unnerving at first, this is something which you very quickly get used to, even when photographing moving objects. Another excellent feature of the M645 Super is, like many other medium format cameras, it was designed as a system camera. This means that as well as being able to change lenses, you could also change viewfinders, film backs and winders in between each shot if you wanted to. So for example, my entry-level version with waist-level finder, manual wind-on lever and single film back can easily be transformed into a super racing version with prism viewfinder, incorporating TTL metering and auto exposure, a battery-driven automatic film winder, and a range of film backs, each loaded with a different type of film. If you're becoming increasingly interested in this camera's tremendous handling and versatility, coupled with the unique look and quality of its images, none of which can really be matched by any camera using 35mm film or an FX sensor, then I've got some really good news and a small caveat. The first piece of good news is that despite its age, the availability of the Mamiya M645 Super system is very good indeed. Although a few of the accessories can take a little bit of digging, everything you need to get yourself outside and photographing is available in good supply on the second-hand market, with plenty of examples in excellent condition. The other piece of very good news is that in the 21st century, this system is clearly not very highly sought after, and this combination of good supply and very low demand leads to prices which are almost too low to be believed in some cases. The best examples of bodies and lenses in this system are often to be found in Japan, but even after international postage, it's possible to put together a system at a ridiculously low cost, considering the very high quality of images that can be produced. Although when it was released in the 1980s, my current system would have cost a small fortune, all parts of it can now be easily obtained for prices similar to that of entry-level DX format equipment. The absolutely gorgeous all-metal and glass lenses, which when they were released cost about the same as a small motorbike, are a particular bargain. Continuing on the good news front, pretty much all types of 120 roll film are still readily available. Although no longer something that you could easily pick up in every high street, a few minutes work on the internet will soon have everything that you need jumping through your letterbox. Although it might feel like very ancient technology, turning your finished rolls of film into negatives is still something that's easily achievable in the 21st century. If you have access to a thermometer, a measuring jug, a changing bag, developing tank and kitchen sink, then with the appropriate chemicals you have absolutely no excuse for getting your hands wet and developing the films yourself. No matter how many times you do it, there really is something quite magical about opening a developing tank and taking out a strip of film that you've actually developed yourself. In this digital age, I expect there are quite a lot of photographers who've never had that experience, and it really is something not to be missed. If the DIY option is not feasible for you, then pretty much wherever you are in the world, there's bound to still be a developing lab that will do it for you by mail order. If you're in the UK, then the Darkroom have always given me an excellent and speedy service, although other labs are still available. In addition, these postal darkrooms can turn your favourite negatives into prints, if you don't have access to a real darkroom. However, for many people, the final link in the chain of film photography will be turning negatives into RAW files on your computer. Although this stage didn't exist when cameras like the M645 were first produced, nowadays it's a very important consideration in the feasibility of film photography. As somebody once said, in the 21st century the quality of your film photography is only ever going to be as good as the quality of your scanner. In this video's long stream of good news about the M645 Super, An important caveat will be making sure that you have access to a scanner that can do justice to its high quality negatives. Currently there are basically three options for getting medium format negatives scanned. In my little head, the top option is to use a dedicated film scanner. This one I've used for many years is the Nikon Coolscan LS8000. As you can hopefully see from the examples in this video, it turns the negatives from my Mamiya M645 Super into RAW files which are more than the match for those from the latest FX censored DSLRs. Although there was a time a few years ago when many people were disposing of these units, and they could therefore be picked up relatively cheaply, nowadays it's almost impossible to get them serviced and very nearly completely impossible to find any spare parts. Consequently, although I can recommend the output of this unit very highly indeed, there's every likelihood it may not be a very good long-term option. Secondly, and very definitely in the prime of current production, are the number of flatbed scanners which come equipped to scan film negatives and slides. Although the task presented to the scanner by the much larger medium format negatives is a much easier one, I really couldn't say I've ever had very much success scanning negatives on a flatbed scanner. However, I also haven't tried very hard due to option 1, and the sample images one sees scanned by some of the top of the range scanners do look very impressive. Finally, if you're losing interest rapidly at the thought of having to pay out for an expensive scanner, then almost all of the postal developing labs can come to your rescue. They can either scan your negatives into a set of RAW files on a CD at the time of developing, or just scan your favourite shots if you send them the negatives. I suspect that when my Nikon LS8000 finally explodes, this might be the option that I'll go for. I'm extremely lucky though in that in a 120 roll of 15 exposures, I'd normally average only 1 or 2 shots that are worth scanning, thus keeping the cost of this option reasonably low for me. If you're one of these talented people who can take 3, 4 or even 5 good shots in every 15, then you may find this option rather more expensive. In the spirit of our opening quotation, if you want a camera that will remind you of the sense of occasion of taking photographs and the magic of producing images, then the M645 Super will do this with every single shot. Even more than this, its negatives can be scanned to produce images which will rival those from even the highest megapixel FX sensor DSLRs. And all of this is readily available at ridiculously low prices. If you've watched the other reviews on this channel, then you'll know we're always on the lookout for products that provide the maximum image quality and photographic enjoyment at the lowest possible prices. On this scale, Mamiya's M654 Super remains an exceptional system, well worthy of your consideration, even though we're now firmly into the digital age. In decades of owning this camera, it's very definitely one which is extremely difficult to put down, and this has very definitely given me a medium format itch over recent years. No matter how ridiculously high their megapixel count, modern FX DSLRs simply don't match so many of the qualities of the images from the M645 Super. However, in true cliffhanger style, after many years of looking, I have in recent months come across a modern digital camera which can start to match some of those irresistible qualities from my M645 images. Tune into part 2 of the JKLenses medium format guide to find out the identity of this mystery camera.